Hello, welcome to the 442nd Fighter Wing's newest endeavor, our podcast. We've had a little bit of discussions on what to call it. We were going to call it HawgCast, but recently some of the air crew or some of the pilots have decided Nasty Time may be a better name for the podcast. So anyway, let us know what you think. We are unsure of what to call it, but just use the Air Force Connect app and kind of submit what you'd like it to be called. So we haven't decided on the frequency yet, but we will try to do these before each of the UTAs. We have a few goals of this podcast. One, we want to go over what is happening at the upcoming UTA. We also want to discuss what has happened operationally through like TDYs or deployments of the past month. 3, answer any questions we've received through the Air Force Connect app or in person. And finally, probably the largest part of the podcast is tell war stories or, just throw an invite out from people in our wing to tell their story or share an experience with us. So we realize the communication barriers in Facebook, Instagram, and our Hog Bites have, and we believe that this podcast will be another way to communicate within our wing and hopefully have some fun while we are at it as well. So with that, I'm Major Shelley Ecklebe. I'm the 442nd Fighter Wing Public Affairs Officer and one of the co-hosts for today's HawgCast. The other co-host is none other than our boss, Brigadier General Steve Nestor, and we have 2, we called them special guests, but they don't like that term, so not so special guests, Lieutenant Colonel John Karl Marks and Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Crack Rowe. So they're both A-10 pilots within our wing. And we're going to chat with them on some of their most recent accomplishments and maybe even get to a war story or 2. So with that, General Nestor, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Shelley. No kidding. We're sitting in a studio, and I want to thank you and Bob Jennings for setting it up. It's awesome. We're like in a recording studio that they have on base. We didn't know they had it. I got the idea to do a podcast from a good friend of mine, Nate Parks, Chief Parks, who was a command chief at Grissom Air Reserve Base. And he started a podcast called Fuel that I listened to, and it was highly entertaining. And he talked about how they had 300 or 400 listeners prior to each UTA, and it was a really good way to communicate to the young airmen. So I figured we'd try to do it here at the 442nd. I always talk about what we want to do with the podcast, and like Shelley said, we want to educate and entertain, right? I want to educate folks on things that are happening in the wing, at the previous UTA, at the upcoming UTA, and what's going on with the A-10. And we want to entertain people by having folks like Crack and Kuda in, telling stories about where they came from, what they've done in the Air Force, and get to know folks. I tell people, hey, you can't lead people unless you don't know their stories. Everybody's got a story, and we can't lead if you don't know the story. We have some amazing stories of people in this wing that we're going to have on the podcast, some folks that just went to Germany and did some stuff for the Ukraine war. We're going to talk to those folks, some folks in newcomers that are brand new to the U.S. that joined the Air Force. We're going to have folks like that on. 3rd and 4th generation people like the Bryants and people that are here whose folks worked here. We're going to have those folks on. Just a lot of different people. So with that, I want to thank Chief Berrien and the folks, all the top 3 folks that ran our OAY, Outstanding Airman of the Year Awards at the February UTA. And recognize some of those folks. First, Airman of the Year was Senior Airman Robin Healy from CE. NCO of the Year was Tech Sergeant Chris Winslow from Security Forces. Senior NCO was Devontae Williams from Security Forces. Senior Master Sergeant Don Johnson was the first shirt of the year over an MXS. And then for CGO was Captain Justin Sievers from Maintenance. And FGO was Major Erica Cordes from Wing Staff and the MXS Squadron Commander. And Civilian of the Year was Lavella, who works in FM, runs FM. So congrats to those folks. So for the March UTA, we don't have a lot right now for March, but hopefully in the future we'll have more stuff on promotions, retirements, and stuff. But right now, off the top of my head, the big thing that's happening in the March UTA is the OSS Change of Command. Lieutenant Colonel Sims will be handing that over to Lieutenant Colonel Hilkert in the 5 Bay on Saturday at the UTA. So with that, last month we just got back from Florida. I think both these guys that are here, we can talk a little bit about that later. We did a CAS 3.0, which is close air sport training down in Avon Park in Florida. We flew 36 to 36 sorties. Maintenance was awesome, so we had 100% sortie effectiveness, so great job on that part. They integrated with F-16s, AC-130s, U-28s, UH-60s, some ISR platforms. They had JTACs running around on the ground and Marine guys doing mortars. And then our maintenance guys also practiced the ATAC program, which is our multi-capable airman training. So we had guys that aren't crew chiefs catching airplanes and fueling airplanes and doing different stuff. So it was a really good opportunity for us as a wing to train in the multi-capable airman arena and get some good CAS training down there. Also in February, General Radliff visited, and I think he got around almost every unit. And I know a lot of what's on your mind is A-10 divestment, and he spoke very openly about that. And I just kind of wanted to reiterate what he said and to kind of put some minds at ease and let you know what's going on with that. So the way that everybody, it's not a rumor or anything, that the Air Force wants to divest the A-10. So we believe in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll have the A-10 here for the next 4 or 5 years. I think we're slated to keep the A-10 till FY28, which is October 1st of 2027. That's kind of all we know right now. What's after that for the 442nd? That's what guys like General Radliff, Congressman Mike Alford, General Healy, who's the Air Force Command Chief of the Air Force Reserves, is fighting for. So all three of us and all of our local representatives are kind of fighting really hard to keep the 442nd in a fighter mission down the road. What that is, we don't know. And that's kind of where we are right now. But I just want you folks out there to know that that's what we're fighting for. We're trying to fight to keep the 442nd in a flying fighter mission after the A-10. So F-35s, F-15EXs, F-16s, you name it, it's all on the table. And we're fighting for one of those missions for you guys. So hopefully that'll kind of clear up what we know. Other than that, we don't know. The way it works in Congress is they have a 5-year plan called the FIDEP, and then they have a thing called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So the NDAA is signed by politicians, and they just signed this year's NDAA. So the first A-10 unit is actually divesting the Fort Wayne guys. They're going from A-10s to F-16s. So until your congressmen and senators weigh in on what the Air Force wants to do, nothing's set in stone. It's just an Air Force plan until the politicians weigh in. That's what's going to happen to the 442nd. So what we're telling everybody is look at the history of the 442nd. It's called the crown jewel of the Air Force Reserves for a reason. Since 9/11, this unit has deployed, I believe, 9 times to Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's kind of some of the stuff we're going to talk to Lieutenant Colonel Rowe and Lieutenant Colonel Marks about, their history of deployments and some of their great stories and DFC awards. So that's all I have for the nasty time of this podcast, Shelley, and then we'll press forward and start getting some good stories from our guests.
Okay, great. And yeah, our main goal of this podcast is to be effective communicators and to be transparent. So as critical decisions are made, we will keep you informed. And if there are any questions that you have that you feel like we haven't answered or haven't answered clearly, again, please reach out to us via the Air Force Connect app or our org box. We do see those messages. General Nestor and Chief Varian see those messages. And it is a good tool to kind of communicate any concerns so that we can address them at the upcoming podcast as well. All right, and now the fun part of the podcast. I am going to actually turn it over to General Nestor, Lieutenant Colonel Marks, and Lieutenant Colonel Rowe. And so they are going to have a discussion on, I would say all things, but I think we would be here for a very long time, A-10-wise. But it's just some of their career highlights and most recent accomplishments. So over to you, General Nestor.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelley. So I asked Kuda and Crack to come in. Man, they're both, Crack's my age, I believe 53, 54 years old, and Kuda's 57?
58.
58.
And a half.
Wow. One to my right, Crack, has got 5,000, just eclipsed 5,000 hours in the A-10, and Kuda has over 7,000 hours in the A-10. To put that in perspective, I've been flying the A-10 since 1994 with a couple, 2 or 3 years where I didn't fly when I was in a staff job. And I have like 3,200 hours personally. So these guys have almost double the amount of flying time in the A-10 that I do. And the reason I really wanted to have these two guys in is because I respect both these guys for the stuff that they've done in their career, and then some of the awards they've gotten, the DFCs, the stuff that Karl did in Desert Storm. But B, really, is my respect for them as fighter pilots. At 54 and 57, 58 years old, these guys are still motivated to be the top instructors and are really two of the top instructors in the 303rd Fighter Squadron. So from my perspective, man, you guys, I see Kuda, I know in your office you have photos of some of your relatives that served in the military. Every time you go fly, you carry a flag in the cockpit, even on a non-combat sortie, correct?
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about what motivates you to, every time you go fly, you put your combat vest on, you take your flag out, and those pictures in your office kind of motivate you to be a better fighter pilot, correct?
Yeah, I don't know when I actually started putting on. I think it's when I got an office and started putting all the pictures of relatives and hearing all the stories, and then realizing that the more I looked into it, I've got a lot. In fact, I have Corporal Gallus Koenig on the wall. He's a corporal in the Civil War on the Union side. So my mom had done some research, so I decided to put him up there, and it's just kind of neat to see how many relatives I have that have served in the military, all branches, over the years, and it kind of motivated me on one of my great uncle before he was getting older and lived in Florida, and I went down there and actually was kind of inspired by some of these projects that, like, I think it's the Veterans Project or whatever. But I had heard he was in the Marines and he had gone on the island hopping campaign, but I didn't really ever hear the stories. So I actually got out of, you just have to kind of get over your reluctance to do stuff. But I was like, okay, and I brought a recorder and said, hey, I heard about some of that you had been in, but what did you do? And he told me all about, he waded ashore in Kwajalein, and he was a combat engineer, and talking about building fortifications while taking Japanese sniper fire and all this stuff, and it was really cool to hear some stories firsthand. And I, like a year later, he had a stroke, and I visited him, and he could barely kind of talk, and didn't, unfortunately, died fairly shortly thereafter. But so I kind of felt good that I'd actually talked to him and gotten some of the stories firsthand. So I put up those pictures just as a daily reminder that there's been a lot of really important military history that my family's been part of in some way or another. Honestly, I'd say what motivates me the most is a different picture I keep in my office, and it's it's an interesting picture. It was in a major newspaper. It's of all things, it's actually a Russian father holding his about 8-year-old son he's severely injured, all burnt up, and it was from a school. It's in South Ossetia. It's a section of Russia that was one of the republics. And the story, though, it just doesn't matter where it is. It hit home to me. What happened was a bunch of Chechen rebels. It just so happens that they were Chechen. It could be any group of people in the world that think they need to change things through violence. They took over a large elementary school, packed all the students in the gym, put giant barrels of explosives with nails and screws in the gym, wired them all together, and then started making demands of really what they were, which were, of course, the kind of demands that weren't going to be met, like all Russian forces immediately leave Chechnya, whatever. And they sent in some special forces. And anyway, at the end of the day, they set off all the explosives and killed several hundred kids. And the only way they got out of there was all the parents in the entire region were surrounding the school, waiting to see what was going to happen with their kids. And so they all ran in there and picked up their kids. So anyway, the picture reminds me is you don't know when your next opportunity is going to be to make a difference. And the bottom line is, very few people are willing to serve in the military, but somebody has to be prepared to deal with people that think it's a perfectly legitimate tactic to take over a school and blow up school children, wherever in the world that is, and somebody has to be ready to do that, and that's us. And so I've always looked at it like, I'm going to take every minute I have and practice bomb and bullet that I get to be ready, so that if you do have an opportunity, and very similar to Afghanistan, we went on many missions, night after night. It was probably not going to be very exciting. It was probably going to be, but you had to be ready, because it, as was reminded by, brings it all together, this CAST 3.0, when you're working with those type of teams, if everything goes right, your job is not very tasking. But that's the point, is that you have to be ready when it goes wrong. And so I never feel like that I have the opportunity. I owe it to, everybody that I don't go out there and take a freebie sortie. It has to be preparing so that when it is time to go, that you don't mess it up.
Awesome. That's good. I'm similar, man. My grandfather was shot down over Sarajevo, and years later I was flying in Bosnia, and my uncle was in our unit, and he said, your grandfather was shot down right over where you flew today. And then my great uncle, he flew P-47s in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, and then my dad was a Vietnam F-4 fighter pilot and 37-year career. So similar stuff, man, between our families. Crack, you're Air Force Academy grad, hockey player, D1 All-Star, right? What got you in that direction, motivated to go join the Air Force and go to the Air Force Academy as a young guy?
Well, growing up, my dad was in the Navy. He wasn't a pilot. He was a radar operator on a helicopter carrier in Vietnam. But he really loved aviation. So we would go to all kinds of air shows and stuff like that. And I just remember sitting on top of an old beater Volkswagen and watching like the Blue Angels when they flew F-4s, and then the Thunderbirds were flying T-38s at the time when I was like really, really young. So just being around aviation and watching and seeing all that stuff, and obviously you kind of like gravitate, certain people, but me for sure, you gravitate towards the fighter jets and stuff like that. So that was something that made me want to start, flying and pursue it. And then the academy thing really came in because I wanted to play Division I college hockey, and I was pretty sure I wanted to fly. And then when I got recruited to go to the academy, I was like, oh, okay, I'll go do this. I didn't really realize what I was biting off at the time, but it panned out. It panned out all right. So I had to go to the prep school at the academy because I didn't have very good grades, which is standard
that doesn't surprise me.
That's standard for a hockey player from Minnesota. And then go in the next year and made it through 4 years, kicking and screaming the whole time. But then afterwards, just waiting to go to pilot training. And then I didn't have like anybody necessarily. My grandfather was in World War II. He was in the Army Air Corps, but he was a ground guy once again. But he chased Rommel all over North Africa and stuff like that, and had really good stories and things of that type. But I didn't really have any like aviation stories or anything that kind of just gravitated that way as a kid from going all to the air shows and stuff like that.
Cool. And both, I know you met your wife at the academy. She was an officer, and kudos, your wife was also an officer in the 442nd, right? Both your wives served?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, she just a couple years ago now retired from the Air Force Reserve.
Yeah, my wife was a recruited gymnast at the Air Force Academy, graduated, did 10 years, and then right around when we had our second daughter, and then 2 weeks later I flew my first mission in Afghanistan in 2002, after 2 weeks after she was born. So that was when my wife kind of was exiting the Air Force after that. She stayed on and did some civil service stuff in the contracting squadron at both Pope Air Force Base and Nellis, but she left being on active duty.
That's crazy. We're sitting here by the TLFs, and in 2003, we got mobilized to go to Iraq for a year, right? And my daughter learned how to walk in the TLF right there, and my wife was pregnant. So we get orders for a year. We leave into March, and my wife's on the flight line with my 1-year-old daughter, pregnant, and I'm like, I'll see you in a year. And my son was born in August. Luckily, I got to come back in July and see him born. But it was very similar. My dad went to Vietnam, and he came back, and he got my mom pregnant right before he left, like a dumbass, and came back, and he had a daughter that was born while he was in Vietnam. So the same thing almost happened to me. So anyway, Crack, let's get to some more stories from both of you guys. So Crack's got 3 DFCs. DFC, for those of you that don't know, is Distinguished Flying Cross. I don't have any myself, so I'm not like jealous or anything, but I've had some cool missions myself, but nothing like Crack. Let's talk about chronologically your first DFC mission And then I know Kudas is before, but he spoke.
Yeah.
And you didn't get to speak at the reunion because he spoke for an hour.
Yeah, he was really very long-winded.
Yeah, he's very long-winded because he's got a long neck.
Yep.
Yeah, so he's long-winded. But let's talk about your first one over in Iraqi Freedom.
I was in the 74th Fighter Squadron at the time, and what happened there was 2 fighter squadrons at Pope, 74th and 75th, and what happened was the 75th was going to go, and I and 2 other individuals from the 74th, so 3 pilots total, they took 3 of us. I had been kind of deeply involved with a lot of planning 6 to 8 months before Operation Iraqi Freedom actually even happened. We were planning things with some of the units that we did CAS 3.0 with, and that was kind of what got us, at least 3 of us, myself for sure, into I was actually supposed to PCS and go to the 422, the Test and Evaluation Squadron at Nellis, and they put another fighter weapons school grad, Tito Hetland, another reservist, they put him at Nellis to fill in for me so I could go to Iraq. So I really owe Tito thanks, and he's probably still screaming about that to this day.
So for those of you that don't know, I'm looking at his patch. He cracks a fighter weapons school graduate, and it's the Air Force equivalent of Top Gun. So really, I'm sitting next to Maverick here.
Better looking.
Better looking.
So we got over there. We had a lot of things planned, and we were waiting basically a couple weeks, if you will, maybe 2 to 3 weeks before kind of things started kicking off. And we had a couple missions that were planned really prior to the official start. But I flew night 1 of Iraqi Freedom, and we had to have our secure radios back at the time were not as nearly as good as they are now, and you guys are laughing and smiling. So you couldn't work with these particular guys on the ground if you didn't have secure communications. So my wingman's radios did not work. And then our contract was day or night, we were going to support these guys single ship because the missions were a little bit higher level missions. We call them task force missions now, but that's where it really kind of came from, I guess. So I was like, all right, man, I'll meet you out there. And I flew about 600 miles into Iraq single ship, which I had not done before. And the weather was, for whatever reason, the weather in the beginning of Iraqi Freedom was miserable every night. So just kind of put the target area off my nose and started trundling in there and knew where my tankers were supposed to be. And then I got there. My wingman still hadn't caught up to me yet. He was literally probably 2 hours behind, and supported some guys who had pushed in from the southern border of Iraq, and it was a airfield takedown where they thought there was going to be some WMD type stuff at the time, and that type of area and that type of equipment that they were trying to find. And so we ended up taking down, I believe it was called H3, but we ended up taking down that airfield, and I just did numerous attacks all about like on my own. There was a couple other airplanes in the task force support that showed up, but I didn't meet up with my wingman until I went to the tanker. And then I went to the tanker, and I had an issue where my jet, I had to do emergency boom refueling, which I've done once, and it was that night. And then we didn't have really many options of places to go for where we were supporting these guys in the area of Iraq that we were in. So we did the emergency refueling. We went back in. My wingman now is with me. We did numerous more attacks for some higher level special operations guys that were on their way in. And that really was that night kind of, if I just kind of try to sum it up, it was the night, I think it was that I went in there single ship and then employed single ship, waiting for my wingman, and then had the emergency issue with the jet on the tanker. I think that was kind of maybe the highlights of, when people write these things. I mean, the mission, the medals are cool and all, but like I'm good buddies with that controller still. Like he has a custom knife company that I have ordered numerous knives from him that he's made for me that I carry with in my G suit when I deploy. So he's a really good guy, and it's more of the missions are made better, if you will, by I think the relationships that you form. And we had planned for so much with these guys that we were all on a first name basis with all of these individuals that were going to be doing way harder, things than we were doing up in our air conditioned cockpit. Yeah, there was some shooting and stuff going on at us, but there's a lot more obviously shooting going on for them down on the ground. So I think that was that first mission was key there.
That's cool. You say relationships. I always say like leadership's about building relationships, and if folks can trust and have trust and cooperation in leaders, that you'll have a better organization. You mentioned H3. You fast forward 10 days when Kuda and I were supposed to go to Turkey for Iraqi freedom, and we didn't get into Turkey. The Turks wouldn't let us in, so we swung around to Kuwait about 6-7 days after the thing started.
April 1st.
Yeah, April 1st.
Easy to remember that one.
And you mentioned H3. General Borgen took a 4-ship up to Mosul, and there was no tankers that showed up. So these guys, it was BB and some other guys, they didn't have fuel to get back to Kuwait.
They went to H1, right?
They went to. I thought it was H3.
I think it was H1. It's way out west.
Way out west. So they went to H1. Anyways, like an area that you cleared out early in the war, they actually landed there and got refueled by some special forces guys with fuel bladders, run around on 4-wheelers. So it was a really cool story of stuff that 442nd did. So probably thanks to the job that you did the first night and get some of those.
Yeah, it's funny because the squadron commander of the 75th, Bino Turner, who is a great guy, but if we were going to have to divert into a certain area where we weren't supposed to be, he's like, hey, just get down there, turn off your squawk, get some gas, and turn your squawk back on once you get inside Iraq.
Yeah.
I was like, okay.
Yeah, Bino's squadron replaced us up in Talil. Yeah, it was interesting. My first sortie in Iraq, across the border with this guy Rags, and day one it was when KC got hit, the guard guy from Michigan got shot down, and the other guy got his engine blown up and had to land at Talil. So all three of these guys get hit within, and my radio's going crazy on the first day I flew in combat in Iraq, and I was like, this is actually real.
Chalk Seawold got shot down.
Yeah. So.
Yeah,
I think they had another guy maybe get.
Yeah, Wolfman had a lot of battle damage. He made it back.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll get back to you, Crack. So over to Kuda. So Kuda, man, in 1990 or 91 for Desert Storm?
Well, we deployed in August of 90, and then the war started in early 91.
So I'm a senior in college watching Desert Storm on TV. We talked a little bit yesterday about, I always thought that your 23 tanks in today's story was on the Highway of Death, but you said no. That was the day after that. I was interviewing with Wolf Blitzer from CNN that day. Tell me the story about both the Highway of Death and your 23 tank story.
Sure. So yeah, I'm not sure where they got kind of mixed up, but the Highway of Death was there's some pretty, any book you get on Desert Storm usually has a couple pages on it, some pretty shocking photos for most people to look at. And so what that was, and again, I was not involved other than I was there. I certainly saw the aftermath like a couple days after it was over, and I saw the area where it was. We saw it. Anybody who flew in Kuwait saw it because it was a very large, and of course in Southern Watch, we were there many times, and everybody has seen those really large multi-lane highways that are running from Kuwait City to the border of Iraq. And so we had, our ROE was in Desert Storm was awesome. It was pretty much go to this area, find military targets and destroy them, and then tell us what you hit. But they were also trusting us a lot to like look at stuff and make a judgment. So most of us had seen this large highway, and there was traffic on it, but it just looked like civilian traffic, and we're like, well, we're not going to strike that. Well, so the three missions that they lumped together and I got my DFC for were on the 25th of February, and then on the 26th, well, we had noticed during those missions as well that there was, I mean, it looked like the entire Kuwaiti population was on that highway. Well, at the time, we didn't know. We were striking targets on both sides of the highway, like revetted tanks and stuff like that, but not on the highway itself. It was literally like this giant traffic jam. And I don't know there's a lot of things in war you find even after all these years that you don't really know what the true story is or how it all happened. But at some point, Intel had made the determination and realized or decided that, however they make those decisions, that these were not in any way civilians. This was once they had realized that the war was lost and whether they did it on their own or whether they got orders from their Iraqi commanders, but every Iraqi soldier in Kuwait City grabbed whatever vehicles they could get, which mostly were civilian vehicles. It was mostly, Chevy Caprices, white Chevy Caprices. That's the most popular vehicle in the Middle East at the time, and pickup trucks. There were some armored personnel carriers. There were a few tanks mixed in, but they had just literally looted everything they could carry, because I guess that's, that was part of their game plan, I guess, as well. If we can't take it over, we're going to loot and leave. And they just shoved everything they could possibly fit from the people who they'd been occupying their homes, got in cars, and were driving north to try to get across the border. And at some point, they decided to go ahead and stop this exodus. And as soon as they did that, well, it was immediate. Just absolute chaos and carnage. As soon as the cluster weapons started to fall, and then as they would drop on the first group of vehicles, well, the vehicles behind would try to drive around. So they immediately started driving around these burnt out vehicles or vehicles on fire into the desert on both sides of the highway, and that sand over there is very, very difficult to drive on. It's very silty and soft, and so they would immediately bog down. And so what it ended up being was like a 3 mile long by mile wide, where you literally you couldn't miss. You were just rolling in, pickling on this giant area of massed vehicles. In fact, Jim McCauley, the previous ops group commander, did employ on that, and he said it was just so strange. You didn't even pick a target; you just rolled in and pickled all your ordnance on that. And every flight into Kuwait, that entire several-hour period, did that. So that was what the Highway of Death was, and it literally, that's the perfect name for it, because it was just that's what it was. And looking at it from the air, it would literally just look like a 3 mile by 1 mile area of burnt-out vehicles that were still smoldering when we went. The ceasefire was on the 28th of February, so it was only like 2 days prior to ceasefire. That's when they decided that, they were all trying to get out. So my group of 3 missions, I got to DFC, were on the 25th of February. It started with typical day when you were on alert. So during the ground war, they had alert CAS airplanes. There were 2 of us on alert, and you would go out pre-dawn and get your jets, what we called, hot cocked for the day. You would start everything up so that if you did have to launch, you could just start it and go. You didn't have to sit there and align all your systems and everything. Most of the time, you would not launch. In fact, I think up to that point, nobody had launched on an alert. You would get the jets ready, you'd go on status, and then all day you'd sit around and wait for them. And then usually by the end of the day, if you hadn't been used, then they would just go ahead and launch you on a normal mission. So we weren't on it wasn't like we were expecting to go. And I didn't even strap in to the cockpit. I just was sitting there, and we started up the INS and everything, and then we called in for words like we do all the time here. And instead of the normal no words, come on in, you would leave your G suit hanging on the jet and everything in case you had to scramble. But they were like, "Yep, call ready for words." And I just remember thinking, and I'm trying to write down grids that they're passing while I'm getting and telling the crew chief, I got to get strapped in because we're launching. And we launched, and I just learned actually very recently, again, from war, you just never know it's very rare to find the true picture, but I just ended up finding out from somebody I knew in the 74th from years back that's now a sim instructor, I think at Moody. Anyway, He was telling you guys that they're the ones that found the convoy that had gone on the move right at dawn, but they were out of fuel, and so they came back and passed that to Bookshelf, who was it was a big C-130 that passed all the information from your back and forth to guys, and that's who we got the information from on our way in. So we got up there right at dawn and found the first tank convoy that had gone on the move, which up until that point they were all stationary. So they'd gone on the move and pulled into the sand. The sand was like very cold that time of the morning, and the tanks were red hot, and we just unloaded all of our Mavericks immediately and then shot several more with the gun. And it was already like probably going to be the best mission of my entire Desert Storm. And you look back and there's like 8 pillars of smoke rising from these burning tanks. We're like,
so all the Mavericks were IR, infrared.
We had for that mission we had all IR, which worked out perfect for that. Yeah, D models. So then we went back to the home station, and thinking, okay, we're done for the day. And they're like, as soon as we got back, like, we have more targets. Get the jets turned and
So
get,
talk
get
to
going
me
again.
a little bit about that. Our maintenance guys are kind of getting back into this ICT world, integrated combat turn. So tell these guys, the listeners, what your integrated combat turn. You told me once it was kind of like ordering at McDonald's, right? Like a drive-through.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what we called it. It was like have it your way at Burger King. You would pull into the spot, and they would climb up. One of the chiefs would wipe off your windshield for you and say, "Hey, what do you want?" And we'd say, "We want 2 IR, 2 EO Mavericks, or 4 cans of CBU, or no free fall, whatever you wanted to do." And we had that set up at the forward operating base, which was up at King Khalid Military City, which is only about 40 miles south of the border. That was excellent because you could go to a really low bingo before you went and got.
So how long time-wise did it take you to turn?
So it'd be like 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Tops.
Fuel.
In fact, I remember it was tough to be able to use a piddle pack. You had to like work it in there because they were on it. They were.
We don't need to start. I don't need to start talking about stuff like that in the cockpit.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
But, so we went. We got back and we're like, okay, well, that was a pretty exciting day. Think we got to lunch and like, okay, you need to turn right now and go back. So we went back up. The second mission was the most exciting of all three of them because it was up near Kuwait City, and by that time the oil fires had been set by the Iraqis on their retreat, and so you have this just the overcast is just black because of these burning fires, and it was also the weather. Surprisingly, at that time, it was kind of about a 4,000 to 6,000 kind of rainy, cloudy overcast, which was pretty unusual. But it just so happened in the ground war that was pretty normal for that. So we came in underneath these clouds, and there's fires burning. And it was just very apocalyptic looking already before we even started shooting anything. And we worked with a Marine airfac. They were in F-18s, 2-seat F-18s. They flew as the airfacs, and they would come out of these clouds. I just remember them coming out of the clouds practically vertically, and they would shoot a couple rockets to point out the targets, and then go back into the clouds. So that's, and they put us onto a bunch of lined up or vetted armor south of Kuwait City that the Marines were concerned with, obviously, as they were advancing from the south, and we cleaned off the jets again, emptied them all out, and again, 8 pillars of smoke from all these burning vehicles. Took a lot of AAA in that area just because we were lower and we were right in there was just flak everywhere, and so we that was a memorable mission for all those reasons, but also because we were really having to. That's what the shooter cover is all about. We were definitely keeping each other honest on, because we were definitely both pretty aggressive. Me and Fish Salmonson, who I was flying with that whole day, and so it was interesting how at some point both of us took turns being the guy that, hey man, I think we probably ought to move from here,
getting too low, too slow, yeah.
Or exactly, kind of keeping each other honest. So after that, we went to the FOL, which was only 40 miles away, and we landed there, and we turned
after your second sortie.
After the second sortie.
So how long did you sit in that jet that day?
It was over like 12 hours in the seat by the time we did it. But
so
we got to the FOL and landed, and we're thinking, okay, we're going to be, we're definitely going to just turn and be done. They said, hey, we got another target for you. Are you guys game for another sortie? So of course we said yes.
Did you have any food? Did you?
I don't remember.
You couldn't order a Whopper at Burger King with your CBU?
I don't remember that. We probably didn't, but you know how it gets. You don't even worry about any kind of. Typically, when you get into all that stuff, you're
adrenaline, right?
Adrenaline's a wonderful thing, and I think you spend the rest of your whole career trying to get those adrenaline back to those levels. Which there were certainly missions later in the career that you kind of remember the fact that because you know how you're sitting in the seat and you're uncomfortable and you're thirsty and you got to go to the bathroom, whatever, and then suddenly you get the call that there's a troops in contact, and then you don't even remember any of that until 4 hours later. You're like, oh man, I am really tired and really hungry, and et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, so we did the third mission again up near Kuwait City, hit more targets. I mean, just the fact that we found that much armor was just kind of lucky, and then we made the most of it, is how I like to put it. You have to be put in those circumstances just by luck that we got that many good targets, but then we didn't leave any sitting. We made the most of it.
There's no such thing. Luck is when preparation meets opportunity.
See, there you go.
All right, that's my motto.
And that's absolutely true, because if you have to be a little, fortunate to get into that situation and find the good targets, but then you got to be ready to go and make the most of it. So we did that, came back, and the way that the interviews happened was, I remember coming back from the last mission, and they had asked, what's your Seagram's code? That was how much gas and munitions and everything. And every mission that day had been, it was 1-1. It was status effective gas.
112000.
Ammo, munitions, and the last was always 00. And they were like, 00. You guys, the third mission, you're 00. What did you hit out there? And I just added up because we used to write everything on the grease pencil on the canopy, and I had been writing all the BDA, slash marks, and I said, we got 33 tanks, 23 of which are, confirmed K kills on fire. And they were like, I remember it was the squadron commander answered. He was up there, and he picked up and said, say that again, on the, when we were calling in, and got on the radio. But so they called the PA, and because at the time it was a press pool, so essentially the press didn't get to embed, or they didn't get to pick stories. They got kind of fed what we wanted to tell them, and so they called over to the PA and said, hey, we got some guys coming back that shot a bunch of tanks. Would you be interested in doing interviews? And then that's how CNN was in the building the next day with all these names. At the time, headline news and that kind of thing was like brand new.
Wolf Blitzer, he was a star.
Wolf Blitzer and Karl Rochelle, and so Fish and I were up there, and luckily for everybody, like Fish he's a much better interviewer. I was kind of just sat there telling the facts and not very animated, and he was just telling about
long-winded.
Probably, and he was talking about how he was describing the explosions and how everything was blowing up and all this other stuff, and so he was a much better interview than us. But that's how that all happened.
So you mentioned some AAA. I know a guy that used to be in our unit in the 446 just retired. Sweetness. Was he shot down right? He was a POW. Was he shot down right around the 25th or before that? And Stormman too. Stormman was in your squadron, right?
Yeah, that was the other most memorable mission by far. As I did like a 6-hour CSAR for Stormman. I was Sandy 2.
Yeah, both those guys were POWs.
Yes, they were POWs together. That was all during the ground war portion. So it was all in those few days right there, because that's when we were pressing in. But
I'll try to get Sweetness to do a podcast with us, tell a story. He's got a great story.
Oh yeah. And in fact, it's always amazing how I years later heard Stormman talk about his experiences that I'd been in the squadron with him and met him numerous times after that, but had never heard all the stories about what they went through. They were in the prison they were in, was bombed by F-117s while they were in the prison. They could hear the bombs coming down through the through the floors. And all that. Just
my son goes to
stories.
Gonzaga in Spokane, and I would stop by his bar, and he was not working or anything, but tons of 810 memorabilia all in the bar. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, he's given a lot of speeches at the SEER school with obviously first-hand experience. So
cool. Well, I'll get back to you on some other Desert Storm stuff. So, Crack, one DFC down, second to go. Tell me about your second DFC. Was it Afghanistan or Iraqi Freedom again?
Iraqi Freedom. I don't remember that it was March or April. For as far as the month go, I had just gotten back from I think I probably had gotten back from a 5 or 7 hour sortie. So we didn't have a lot of guys that were qualified to sit CSAR alert. So
CSAR is combat search
and rescue. So I was sitting alert as Sandy 1, and my wingman, who was my combat pair, Thud Del Vecchio, who flew with me on all the task force missions, he was not a Sandy 2, but he was sitting alert with me to fly Sandy 2. So I am literally in my G suit, my feet are flat on the floor, I'm laying on a cot, and I just have my harness and vest, I'm kind of laying on it as a pillow, and I am completely out cold. I am sawing logs, I'm probably snoring as loud as can be, and I remember it's nice and dark. It's nighttime. The life support area where all the flight equipment guys were working, it was super black, and the air conditioning was great. And I'm unconscious sleeping. And our life support tech comes over and he's like, sir, and he's tugging on my flights. He's like, you're getting launched. And I'm like, what? I'm still half asleep. I'm like, are you serious? Because we had literally just landed. The pilot rest thing was kind of not really happening that well. And so he's like, yeah. So we get up, we grab our stuff. Our jets were all ready to go, just like like Karl had talked about earlier. Hop up in there, and the intel guy, just like you always train your like scenarios in training, the intel guy comes up the ladder, and he hands me a map and the coordinates. And normally when you're Sandy 1 and you're leading the CSAR, you don't necessarily know where these isolated personnel are. Like, is it a pilot? You got to find them. So you got to find out their condition, you got to find their location and all the threats. And that's normally the things that are pretty rough. Well, we kind of knew the threats because this was literally in downtown Baghdad, and we had the location, and it was like a spot on location, which is unheard of having that at launch time. But the reason that we had it was because it was a bunch of Marines that they were moving to a big highway with all the 4 clover leaves and the bridges, and it was a casualty collection point. So they were bringing all these Marines that were injured that needed immediate evac. The problem is that we're in the A-10 and we're in Al Jaber in Kuwait, and we got to go all the way to Baghdad, which is 2.5 hours to get up there to do this combat search and rescue. And on the way up there, it was probably when we were talking about how bad the weather was. Well, this was like the worst. It's probably some of the worst weather I've flown in, maybe some of the worst weather I've flown in this day. It was sandstormy, horrible, like Talil, which was just north of Al Jaber, but Talil was in Iraq. I'd call it, south central-ish Iraq, if you will. But like they had like half a mile viz. Like it was bad. And I looking at the gas and talking to Thud as my wingman, and I'm like, hey man, you got to get on the radio. You got to get us tankers to start pushing up there. I'm going to let everybody, and you would love to think that everybody understands the call sign Sandy 1 on the radio, but nobody understands what that means. And being able to fly with the Sandy 1 call sign in combat as a combat search and rescue dude is pretty awesome because of the legendary A1 guys flying the Sky Raiders back in Vietnam, and the community and the environment and all the groundwork that those guys had laid down. Like, you wanted to stand up to that, right? You wanted to do a good job, and you're flying with that call sign. You're like, this is for real, right? So we're going up there. We're in the weather. Like, there was numerous missions where we'd turn our lights off, take the runway, and take off, and then we'd just be in an altitude block, and Thud's basically just following me on an air-to-air TACAN. Like when all the young guys are all upset that their data link doesn't work. I'm like, dude, we went
pre-saddle,
we went 600 miles into Iraq as 2 of us, and all we had was a air-to-air TACAN. That was it. Like we were just going, So we're on our way up there, and because of how bad the weather was, it was really, really affecting. What's the number one lesson learned in combat search and rescue? Communications is always terrible. Well, literally, of all the frequencies allotted to all the allies and the NATO partners and all the U.S. dudes flying in Iraq, I literally can find one frequency that I can get me and my wingman, the King, which was the C-130, the rescue C-130, and then the Jolly, the helicopter, that I can get all of us on one frequency. Finally get these guys on the radio, and because of the fact that nobody is really paying attention to what we're doing with a combat search and rescue, there's like guys in the big stack over Baghdad waiting to try to do close air support, which isn't going to happen because it's like a 20-foot visibility down there. They're like, if you don't get off this frequency, there's going to be other people on the ground. And I got this. It was my highlight of all my radio calls of my entire career. I was like, this is Sandy 1. I have King 01 and Jolly 2 on the frequency. The frequency is mine. Get off. Most glorious radio call ever in my career. And everybody was quiet after that. And I was like, thank you. So we got up there. The helos picked up the guys. And it's really interesting because we are up in the weather. You can see tracers and stuff happening, but like nobody's really shooting at us, right? But there's definitely more of a threat to the helicopters, the rescue helicopters, and obviously the 130. So the rescue helicopters pick up these guys. But as we were going up there, I'm not going to make it in time because of the distance. And so Foot Millen was an active duty guy at the time. He was also a fighter weapons school instructor when I was a student there. And then Sumo Brown was Foot's wingman, and Sumo was a guard guy at Idaho.
Idaho, yeah.
And they hear bits and pieces of stuff on the, like, kind of that lane, the central lane of Iraq, the frequencies that everybody's using in the central lane versus the eastern or the western. And Foot comes up on my inner flight, and he's like, "Hey, do you need help?" And I'm like, "Absolutely." I go, "Dude, you need to." So I give him information and give him a handoff, and he helps with the initial pickup. And then we without Foot, those guys would not have had any possibility, even though the weather was bad, but they would have had no possibility of any air cover or rescue support or escorting those guys, escorting the helicopters in obviously in bad guy land. Without Foot and Sumo, that they wouldn't have had any cover. So kudos to those guys, because they got so short on gas that they literally had to land at Talil in that basically mile-ish visibility.
They didn't have approaches in there either.
No, and they just had to make it happen because they were out of gas and out of ideas. And I handed it off to them, and then as we were going from Baghdad, from downtown Baghdad, and the thing about Baghdad was all the overpasses and the bridges and stuff. That's where KC got shot.
Yep.
So they were like kind of they would hide underneath them. Like if you ever listen to Doc Strasburger and Billy Bob Thornton, they have done numerous podcasts because they both got silver stars, but they were like bouncing bullets up underneath the bridges of some of the overpasses to try to hit the enemy that was shooting and stuff. So they pick up these guys, 13 plus guys. Some of them are like legitimately getting surgery kind of as this whole thing is happening, is the story that we were kind of told. But we pick them up as they're going back to Al Qut, which initially was like a Republican Guard kind of stronghold, but it had been bombed pretty good. So we did a transload from the helicopters, all of the patients, if you will, all the guys that got rescued. They transloaded them onto the C-130, and then we took the C-130 back further south as much as we could. And it was the thing about it that was painful is that it was almost like the bookkeeping or like the Sandy 2 job of knowing where all your assets are. Where's our tanker? Where's our gas? How much time do we have? What's the frequency that we're on? What's the threat update? What's the update on the guys on the ground, all their situation as far as health or injuries are concerned? How can we pass as much of this back to the guys who are going to pick them up and do some of the medical procedures to help them survive? And everybody lived, which is a great part of the story. But we just kind of did a lot of that and not necessarily as much killing stuff with an A-10, if you will. The other cool thing about it was the rescue, the helicopter guys, and I'm sure the guys in the HC-130 as well, they won Rescue of the Year for that rescue.
Awesome.
So that was that's a pretty neat thing. And I've actually met with some of the helicopter dudes, and they're all reservists too. So their plaque is hanging in the bar at Cocoa Beach in the fellow reserve squadron, in the HH-60 squadron there. So it's kind of neat to see those guys get recognition for flying in some absolutely horrible conditions and literally saving all of those guys' lives with getting there, having enough gas to get them someplace safe, having enough the PJs and the back end folks on the HC-130 to help them get the medical attention that they needed. And the even funny more funny thing is, like I said, my wingman he wasn't a Sandy 2. He wasn't a qualified Sandy 2. So we got back to Al Jabber, and I wrote a grade sheet, and I just said, flew Sandy 2 in combat, recommend Sandy 2 qualified. And I gave him like a 4 on the grade sheet. Like, you never give anybody a 4, right? So I'm like, yeah, give him a 4. He did good.
That's awesome. That's an awesome story. I'll get back to you on your third DFC.
Well, and I've put one in on that as well, as far as the CSAR. When Fish and I did the CSAR for Storeman, the funny story there is, or interesting, I guess some things just don't change, because that was in 91. The Sandy guys, all the Sandy qualified guys, which was a big deal, you know, at that time to go through the Sandy upgrade. Everybody wanted to be a Sandy, most experienced guys. Well, they got tired of sitting alert they were like, so they got together and said, we think that we don't want to sit alert for the whole, because luckily there weren't a lot of people getting shot down, obviously. So they wanted to get in on
some
all the targets to check out other guys as Sandy, so we could sit alert. So my entire Sandy checkout, and me and Fish's was a 30-minute discussion in the back in the billeting room, and then they go, okay, you're
Sandy qualified.
You're flying up to the FOL tomorrow. You're starting Sandy alert, and then a day after that, we were launching on a CSAR
on Stormans.
On Stormans CSAR, and it was the same thing. The stuff I still remember of the klaxon goes off, and we're like, here we go, and then an 06 climbed up the ladder and handed me and it was the information, and he's like, good luck, son, and shook my hand, and I'm like, because I'm like, I'm 26, I'm the Sandy 2, and then we open up the stuff, and it's
one of your
his
guys.
ISAPREP, and it's Storman. He's my flight commander, and I'm like,
that's crazy.
And so Fish and I are like, let's go get him. I mean, we were.
It's always the
gung-ho,
good luck thing, because the first night that we launched for Operation Iraqi Freedom, they were all night sorties for us, and as you're taxiing out, literally, I don't know if you guys ever had this, but the priest is doing the water on the airplane, and I'm like,
no,
I've never seen that.
Does this guy know something that I do not know?
Yeah.
Because I'm currently not Catholic, but I can be in 30 seconds if needed.
I don't remember that.
I want to make sure everybody understands.
That's hilarious,
yeah,
man.
I'm like, oh boy.
There's some sorties that I still lose sleep over, right? I remember I was escorting these guys, a convoy escort in Afghanistan, and my job was to look for IEDs out in front of them, people loading IEDs. We're 30 minutes into it, IED goes off. And so the next day, I'm standing at Bagram in the procession line of a funeral of the guys I was watching their caskets go by me. And I'm like, damn, man, just hit me. Could I have done something better to not have this happen, Or a sortie where I had a guy launching RPGs at these Brits and rolled in and strafed 300 rounds. He's in the corner of this building with no or what's it called, with no roof on it. Kalat. I put 300 rounds right into the guy, and he runs out of the building. None of them hit him, and gets on a motorcycle.
Magic Nikes.
Yeah, and he starts, and I mean, still to this day, both those sorties. Any sorties, Kuda, that you lose sleep over from back in the day?
I mean, honestly, the ones that I tend to think back and go, what could I have done different, are the ones where either we in Afghanistan, you guys know how it was. It was almost to be able, you knew the guys were bad guys. You've been watching them do bad things, and then you had to convince the powers that be that you could engage them. And there was a couple of times that I was unable to convince them. And I think back, if there's something I could have said differently or something. And then also on like you said, a target where that we learned on the go, as you learn all kind of techniques like parroting clearances and stuff like that. There were passes where you knew you were only going to get one chance, and then for some reason you didn't get clearance, and then you couldn't. So to me, I guess I'd sum it up with, at least from the Afghan war for sure, it was the ones that got away, that the ones I think back and go, oh, what could I have done different?
Same.
So,
or if you miss.
Same.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
If you have a laser on the target and a laser rocket goes astray or goes stupid, or the LGB, or for whatever reason it just misses, and you're like, I don't get the effects that I want.
And as you probably well know, but I know I drove weapons officers crazy on all of my Afghan trips, because they'd always come back and go, okay, Karl, let's have a discussion about your, I mean, I can remember one where it was actually his I can remember his call sign was a little red Corvette. He was the Taliban leader in the one place that they were really trying to get, and he went and crawled under a culvert, and to get him, I had to shoot inside a culvert over a stream, and let's just say, I got pretty close and low, and so it was always like, hey, okay, good job, you hit the target, don't do that again. And unfortunately, I got that talking to several times, but it was exactly what Crack said, is that you were in situations you're like, I really don't want to miss.
No.
And as we know with the A-10, there's lots of different ways to do it, but the best way is to get low and close enough that you're not going to miss. And I never wanted to come back from story and go, yeah, we had I tracked this guy for 2 hours and we've got our window to shoot him, and I missed. So I was just like, so that tended to influence my tactics that I would use, and
So
I had a few discussions with.
so like
The whites of their eyes.
part of being a squadron commander was
I make no apologies for that.
yeah,
by the way.
every time we employed, you had to go watch the film with the
Oh
wing
yeah,
commander the next
you were
day.
you were graded.
So the wing
certainly.
commander, not only did I have to go see him about film, I'd have to go see him about Tango wearing the wrong color underwear or socks at the gym, you know. So anyway, I go in and he's watching my film from the day before, big deal, and general big deal. And he looks at me and he goes, Nasty, when you get a 9-line, you don't freaking miss. And I was like, yes, sir. And that
Good for him.
yeah, that's what he said. So, Crack, real quick, we're not running out of time, but we want to keep
You
the
have to have us
listeners
back. On
Yeah.
Another one. We've got lots of stories.
So, in Afghanistan, I think the precursor to your Kentucky Guard deal was you and Jimmy hit guys on a moped, right? And they went into a field and you strafed them.
Yes, there was. Well, we took off and we got. It was the standard Afghanistan roving motorcycle gang, right?
Yeah.
You had a mission that you planned. And
Well, that
literally
was all on the
and
same- that's
literally
right, that
our
was on
and
the same
literally
mission.
as we took the runway to take off and we were running up our engines and we were just about to release brakes, they're like, "Hey, your JTAR has been canceled, and you're going to go here instead." And I wrote it down and I released brakes and took off, and we went very close to Bagram Air Base there, like 50 miles south, to a troops in contact. Because remember when troops in contact used to be a situation?
They had various levels.
It used to be a situation,
right.
and we evolved it, maybe not smartly, into a targeting category.
That's
right?
because JTACs are very clever, and when
Smart.
you try to make it difficult to kill the bad guys, they
So-
will come up with a way to do it.
We got diverted to a troops in contact, which was some guys on the ground. But when we showed up, there were already 2 Apaches there, and it was kind of, I guess, over for the most part, if you will. Then we got pushed to what you were talking about, the IED emplacers, 2 guys on the motorcycle. Tracked them. Actually used one of the balloons to help us get kind of correlated to, because they were maneuvering through an area where there were multiple civilians and places that people live and try to have their daily life. We waited. We targeted him. The 2 of them, as they left the town, we had clearance to employ, and then we used the targeting pod, which was kind of newer, if you will, a little bit for all of us, to kind of, my wingman was Brigadier General retired Jim Mackey, and fellow Air Force Academy hockey player, by the way. Hockey players make good fighter pilots. He was IDing the target and marking the target with his targeting pod, and I have obviously something in the heads-up display which kind of cues my eyeballs to where he's looking. Strafed the motorcycle while it was moving. It kind of just got, I shot, and most of the bullets kind of hit right next to the guy, but they blew up the motorcycle and they crashed, and then they started crawling. I think one guy was maybe okay as far as his condition, and another guy I think was maybe hurt a little bit worse. But they crawled into the middle of a field. But so when they're moving, you could see them.
Yeah.
But as soon as they stopped moving, it was like there was it was just looked like a field. Like they blended in completely. But Jimmy Mack still had his targeting pod marking them, and I came back around and we shot him, or I shot him again. The interesting thing about that is we had
One guy survived.
right, and we had a guy in the squadron, Dr. Bombay, who at the Chow Hall at Bagram runs into a guy that he went to medical school with. And so this guy goes, "Hey, Dr. Bombay, I think you guys shot some guys off of a motorcycle today." And Doc is like, "Yeah, it was Jimmy Mack, or Crack and Jimmy Mack, and da-da-da-da." And he's like, "Hey, well, they brought the one guy that lived to the hospital on base at Bagram. So like 50 yards away from where we were all living in our bee huts is this guy that I had just strafed. The one guy was dead, and this guy lived but had some pretty bad injuries. But this guy's like, 'Hey, do you want to come over and see him?' And I go, 'No, I do not want to come over and see him.' So after they let him go, I went over there and I got to see this guy's like CT scan and all of the x-rays and stuff. And he was riddled with metal. And the doctor was like, 'Hey, normally we get these guys, we patch them up, we let them go, and normally the villagers where they were implanting IEDs all over the paths that were going to create havoc for the people's children, he's like, normally the Afghanis just, they take care of the problem on their own. He goes, but this guy's not going to live here probably. So they both, I'd like to, sadly, I'd like to think that the guy died, but he deserved it.
I thought Dr. Bombay went and saw him.
Dr. Bombay did go and see him, and the guy he spit at him, and they had him all shackled up to the hospital bed when Doc Bombay went to see him.
Because I was like, but Doc, man, why did you go over there? He goes, I needed to look the enemy in the eyes. And I was like, oh my God. So anyway, that was a good story. So you get off the moped, guys, and you get retasked down to the Kentucky
we
Guard
get
guys.
retasked to the original
tick.
Well, we get retasked to our original tasking, which was going to be escort a convoy out of a fob. We check in on the radio, and the guy goes, there's no convoy. And we finally get a hold of a JTAC who's at that fob, and he goes, oh, those guys are having vehicle troubles. Can you just do a show of force, like check out their route, and then make sure it's okay, and see the best that you can see to help them feel safe if they're going to leave the confines of the forward operating base and drive on Afghani roads, which I think would make anybody, quite frankly, petrified. And so we did that, and then the JTAC, it was purely an act of God. The JTAC comes on the radio and says, oh, I'm getting some other traffic on another radio frequency that one of our convoys is taking fire. Can you guys check it out? Sure. Gives us the coordinates. We're literally 7.5 miles away. So we're like, we're there in a minute. And that was where chaos completely started to ensue there. And a lot of the stuff from that mission I knew was going on to the best of my ability from talking to them on the radio, but I've learned a lot after the mission by being really, really good friends with some of the Kentucky Army National Guard guys that to this day are good buddies. So we check in, and there are 3 vehicles that are in kind of a curvy pass with high terrain kind of on each side, really high terrain on their left side. And then around this corner, so they're like out of sight of each other now, is about like 25 vehicles. So we don't really know. There's one guy on the radio, and we don't really know who we're talking to. We think that we're talking to the 3 because one of them you could see in the targeting pod, and you could kind of see with your eyeballs looking out the canopy, had a bunch of like gas, oil, hydraulic fluid that was pouring out and making a big puddle. Like you could see the puddle really well in the targeting pod. That it's disabled. It's not that vehicle. It was an MRAP. It's not going anywhere. And the person that we're talking to is really, really calm on the radio. Like, hey, Hog 51, this is FedEx 06. Hey, we got some guys here. And I'm going, man, this guy seems really calm for like this, where they're at, and hey, we're getting shot at. And come to find out, the individual we're talking to is the like convoy commander, but he's in the vehicles, the 20 vehicles that basically took off when they got stopped in basically converging fields of fire. It was an ambush area from the enemy. They had guys up high on their left-hand side, and they had guys over here. I never knew there were guys on their right. I knew there were guys on their left from the radio calls. Anyway, the guy up front is on the radio, but he's not the guy who's getting shot at. That's why he sounded so calm. It was horrible chaos, like kind of, I don't know, I guess you could say like movie type situation back in the MRAPs, because the lieutenant, and God bless this kid, their commanding officer in those 3 vehicles that were there, because it happens differently to different people, he curled up in the fetal position and was crying in the corner of the MRAP. And then one of the sergeants, who Buck is his name, and who I chat with all the time still, he kind of then became the NCO in charge, right? He's the guy. There was another guy, Derek, who, if you like, I would explain Derek as this kid who always wanted to be in the Army, like his whole life. And then he happens to be one of the 16 soldiers that's between these vehicles. Like that scene in Saving Private Ryan where that guy's walking around and it's just like slow motion and kind of garbled sound, but that guy picks up his arm like he's like he doesn't have any idea what's going on. Well, Derek is outside the vehicles just trying to hook up the disabled MRAP to the one in front of it so they can tow it out. But meanwhile, it's RPGs and heavy machine guns and stuff. And
you can, every time they key the mic, you can hear it, right?
no, because the guy I'm talking to
it's on
is
the
in
other
that
side.
front. Right. So I can see some things happening, but I don't know the massive amount of confusion and chaos that's going on for the guys in the convoy. Like one of the drivers took a round in his helmet, in his Kevlar helmet, like an AK-47 round, and the Kevlar did its job, but it kicked the round this way, and then it went out the back. So he just had a big cut and everything here, but he didn't die, right?
Yeah.
So luckily the helmet worked. It took us probably like 15 minutes to figure out what was happening. The JTAC from on the other side of a mountain is still trying to talk to us because the rules of engagement were you had to have a qualified controller give you clearance to attack a target.
He was at a forward operating base.
Yeah, he's like 7 to 10 miles this way, but the radios don't work very well if you get down low through the mountain. So Jimmy Mac is up at like 20,000 feet trying to relay, trying to do what the rules of engagement were to the JTAC, what's happening. We're around the circle. I'm down at 100 feet. I go over a couple times. I'm looking. They say, hey, I didn't know. We never saw muzzle flashes at us, but they said, hey, they're shooting towards you guys too. And these 3 vehicles are not moving anywhere. And these guys that are inside are, and one outside, but he goes inside. They're not getting out of this. The vehicles are getting riddled and getting filled with holes, quite frankly, just because they're taking so many hits. Finally, what happened, the thing that cued me in was they shot a smoke grenade. It was a yellow smoke, and they shot it up the hill, but this hill's like very, very steep on their left-hand side. They're trying to mark the target. So I'm talking to the guy that's around another ridge. He's telling these guys back here, the guys who are really in trouble, to mark a target. And the smoke goes up on the hill, and then it just kind of rolls right back down and lands like 5 feet from the MRAP. And I'm going, that's a little close. So then they shoot another smoke off the left 10 o'clock of the front vehicle. It's about 60 meters away from the front vehicle. Luckily, it's up the hill a little bit, so that kind of helped us target it and not be really, really close to shooting towards the friendlies. And Jimmy Mac's like, ask him if he wants us to shoot the smoke. And I say, do you need me to shoot the red smoke? And the guy up in that front vehicle keys the mic, but somebody in the vehicle with him screams and says, say yes, God damn it, say yes. And that was like, ding. That was like kind of the key. Okay. Jimmy Mac's like, do you need me to descend? I said, come down here, wedge shooters, guns on the smoke.
And you're to 60 meters, 180 feet, so we're looking out the window. It's like to that black car.
And so I had never, in all of the times that I've employed with JTACs, I had never had danger close proximity targets. And then I had never had to where I had to declare
Emergency
cast
gas.
with a non-qualified controller, a.k.a. no controller, because these Army Guard guys they had never really even seen an A-10 before. And so we declared emergency close air support and danger close. We never got, per the joint pub, we never got any initials because these guys wouldn't have understood what I was going to say anyway. So we just said, here's what we're doing. Rolled in, and I shot 30 millimeter and all of my high explosive rockets. Jimmy Mac shot 2 passes of 30 millimeter. He did not shoot any rockets, but the kind of interesting thing is when I've talked to these guys afterwards that like the rockets were the holy cow, the showstopper. I think it's just because they're loud and they're high explosive rockets, and they maybe hit right where they needed to be. Because one of the guys, Alejandro Arias, he goes by Musta. He was the 50 cal gunner up in the turret, and when he looks, he like sees me pointing at something 60 meters in front of him, and he's the only guy up and out of a vehicle, and he looks and he thinks he's never done any of this. Like these guys are on their 4th convoy of like a 17-month deployment, and he thinks
you're going to shoot him.
He thinks I'm shooting him, so he dives into the vehicle, and other guys that were in there are just like, "Oh man, it's all good." He goes, "No, they're shooting. They're shooting at us." In his best, what he would say, his best Spanglish. And so it finally happens that we take care of the situation. We get it all taken care of. The biggest part of the story, though, is afterwards, they about 2 days later, 3 days later, they all came to Bagram to kind of rekit and refurbish their MRAPs. They basically needed new MRAPs, or they needed new plating on them because they were littered with bullet holes. And I went over. They came over to see us.
They came to our squadron.
Yeah, they came to the squadron. We met them, chatted with them, pictures in front of the A-10. Everything's cool. They're very, very wired up, though. Like, they're very amped up Army guys. Man, did you know, I shot this guy, you shot that guy. You know, like, it's just nonstop. And I went over to their tent, and it was just this nonstop chatter as there's like bullets, like ankle deep bullets in their tent, and there's rockets in there and stuff. Like, all their stuff, they just like splayed all over the place, and these guys are still amped up. Well, fast forward that 5 years later, Musta marries a senior airman in the Air Force. She gets stationed in the medical group at the hospital here. And he sees an A-10 coming into land, and it basically triggers his PTS. So all these guys have some
PTSD.
Pretty serious PTS, like suicide attempts, and/or they lost, I think, 2 guys from their unit to suicide when they came back. One guy, I'm sure it had to do with PTS. One of the guys in their unit was murdered by his father. When they got home, there were other things happening. And that's what I always try to, like, you train your whole time, like we're talking about, like that, like emergency close air support, danger close, and everybody lives is like, it's basically the Super Bowl of being an A-10 guy, right? You've hopefully helped somebody else get home. But the greatest mission that you ever have.
I told you I'd get you to laugh and cry.
Yeah.
I told you.
It's a horrible day for them. And that's the lesson. Like, you meet those guys, you're like, oof, because there's some demons.
Yeah.
For sure. So it's interesting because you get an award for it or stuff, but you meet these guys and they're just like, hey man, like you literally saved us. Like that was it. We all came home. We all, had kids, and some of them have had kids and gotten divorced and gotten remarried, but they're all doing well. The 3 to 4 guys that I really like keep in touch with, but it's a very interesting situation because
they gotta live with that.
Yeah,
right?
They gotta live with that, and you live with it in a completely different way because you were in your air-conditioned A-10 cockpit, and yeah, somebody in Afghanistan shooting at you, sure, but just the threat to air, unless you're a helicopter guy in Afghanistan, never really became that big of an issue, And that one, like I said, that's a very interesting thing because, like, I went to Musta's college graduation, I went to his wedding, So I mean, it's been a friendship, and Jimmy Mac's in touch with him, and we have kind of a little bit of a pact where there's been some tough times for those guys where we have to have each other's addresses to do if you need to do a wellness check. That's for PTS individuals or anybody who's dealing with resiliency and all the stuff the Air Force talks about. If you don't have the person's lesson learned, by the way, if you don't have the person's address or where they physically are, it is virtually impossible for you to get any type of law enforcement guys to go do a wellness check to make sure they're okay. Because I've gotten some texts every once in a while where I'm like, that sounded horrible, and I need to make sure or do something to make sure they're okay. So
yeah.
It's always for real for those guys, even after that day and 20 or 15 years later, right? It has had a profound effect on their lives.
Awesome. Man, this is Shelley. What do you think about some of these stories?
I've been in a fortunate position to hear, just through our job, to hear from you guys. And, I think cool is not an accurate term. What you guys do is incredible. And I think to your point, Crack, when you talk about, really as a family, these guys are Army guys that you still keep up with. And, just thank you for sharing it. You guys are always humble when you do these things. And, just from like an outsider looking in, we just appreciate your honesty. We appreciate your humbleness. And we appreciate your willingness to tell the story. So yeah, we hope to continue this. And if, there are a lot of stories in the wings. So nominate your friends, nominate people, and it can be like anything. I know we have a couple airmen from Africa.
Yep.
They'd be cool to get on the podcast.
Brand new citizens have been here less than a year that just joined our unit.
Yeah.
Lots of cool ideas that I have for interviewing people, right? Like Sweetness, like Chief Parks. I want to have him come down and interview him about his podcast, and he's got an amazing resiliency story.
Chevy.
Chevalier, yeah. Or Chevy Oric, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to get
her on here. But man, you two guys, I tell you what.
I know. She said she would do it as long as she's not, her face isn't in it. So.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, man, because her story's incredible.
She doesn't like pictures of herself. But you thanks for coming, Kuda and Crack. Like you were saying, people are alive because of what you two guys have done. And you guys inspire me. Mostly because, I know as a 54 and 58-year-old guy, you could have gone down a different path and maybe done what I'm doing and been a wing commander, a general. But you guys are truly warriors, and you wanted to continue to be warriors. I know Crack's retiring June 6th?
June 9th.
June 9th. But you guys wanted to continue to be warriors and A-10 fighter pilots. Kuda's going to do it for another 2, maybe 4 years. We'll see. Trying to get him an extension past 60, if we can swing that. So General
He's
Healy,
nodding over here.
General Healy, if you're listening to that, sign the waiver, please. Thanks for inspiring me, and lots of. Hopefully, people will listen to this and get inspired, man. If you're working in CE and you got to repair a runway, if you're a maintenance or ammo guy, like listening to these stories, like minutes and what you do matters to get us in the air. If you're a security forces guy, LRS, FSS, ops, wherever you work, hopefully you'll be inspired by kind of listening to these stories, and like these guys shared, get really good at your craft, because minutes and seconds matter to get us out the door, to get us up in the air. And
I've always been one of the most fun, I think, parts of all the years I've been flying the A-10 is we got to be an FCF pilot pretty early, and I've had a much closer relationship with maintenance just as part of doing that.
You've changed tires, you've changed engines, right?
And I think that has, that's been one of the most rewarding parts as well, to get, you have a much closer relationship with maintenance, and to see, because most guys just don't really, they, in a general way, but they don't really know just how much goes into just flying one A-10 for 1 hour. It's astonishing when you actually get in there and see what
those
they
Kentucky
do.
guys came up to, like, we put them in the simulator and kind of like we can put them in Iraq, like they can be in the A-10 and look at the
valley
vehicles. They can like look at it on the map and stuff and see. But they all went to meet our maintenance guys as well. And Chris Barton at the time, he's still here, but he was the crew chief of Tail 123, and that's the jet that I was in.
Chris does really good models, by the way, if you ever.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome.
And,
awesome models.
But that's the thing I always, and we probably need to let them, if the guys ever come back up here, let them come to meet some of the newer, younger maintenance guys. But I got in that jet. I got in Tail 123. That was the jet I was supposed to fly. I didn't need a red ball. I didn't have any delays like you were talking about, because if you talk to Buck or Musta or Derek, they will tell you probably another 3 to 5 minutes. This is what they were going to do. They were running out of ammo, and they were going to literally fix bayonets and charge the hill, because Buck was in charge, and he's like, me and my friends here, we're not dying in these vehicles. We're not dying in these MRAPs. So we're gonna go out swinging, and we're gonna charge that hill, because we were out. They had no other options. So if those jets didn't take off on time and get there, that's why I said 7.5 miles away. It just was a pure act of God in aviation to have us be that close. But that's the important thing, that the younger now, which we have quite a few more younger active duty maintenance guys, like, let them meet some of these guys and go, hey man, that jet, when it flies well and it flies on time, this is what happens.
Totally. And man, this wing's got an awesome history of combat stories like that, and that's why you guys listen out there. That's why I'm fighting really hard to get this wing another fighter mission after the A-10. So hey, thanks again to Bob Jennings and Major Shelley Ecklebe for setting us up in the room. We're gonna continue to do this, guys. I think hey, we want to communicate to you guys on your phones, man. You 18 to 30-year-old airmen out there. My dad still sends me emails that I don't read, and I know you don't read my emails. So I'm trying to get after communicating to you guys on your phones. Hopefully this is be a good aspect of that. So we want to hear from you. We want to hear good stories from people in the wing. And thanks for listening to HawgCast and Nasty Time.
Nasty Time. Yeah.
All right.